I continue with the third perspective on listening, which assumes that listening has to do with individual differences or is affected by individual differences as well. There are two types of individual differences in this approach. One of them is personality based differences, and the other one is non personality based. Regarding personality based, we can you can conceptualize it in terms of factors like motivational qualities. For example, if someone is not highly motivated to listen to another person, or there is no motivation at all for that person to listen to a lecturer, neither intrinsic nor extrinsic motivation, then the listening comprehension process will not be very successful. This indicates that if a person does not understand or does not listen to another interlocutor, it doesn't necessarily mean that the listener does not have the ability to listen, but it might be that motivation is not there. So that's the first factor. The second factor is the non-personality based individual differences. It includes cognitive complexity and listening style preferences. The cognitive complexity has to do with some people's ability to encode the conversation or encode the listening message more deeply and interpret it and recall it in a more sophisticated way. I think all of us have probably encountered people whom we think are more sophisticated listeners. To give an example, most experts in their own field are more sophisticated listeners when it comes to a conversation about the field in which they have expertise. If you are speaking with a doctor about some of the symptoms that you have recently had, like a runny nose, sore throat, fever, etc., the doctor will listen to it in a more deeply fashion than an ordinary individual will do, because the doctor is more cognitive complex than an ordinary person when it comes to that topic. So how do we become more cognitive complex? Well, it has to do with our long-term memory and the knowledge that we have accumulated over the years about one topic or two. If, like I said, if you become an expert in a field, then you would be considered to be a cognitive complex individual, because you will be able to encode the message that has to do with that field, and interpret it and also retrieve it in a much more sophisticated way than ordinary people will do, because you can read more to it and you can map it onto the structures that you have already created, like the schema and the script that you have already created and stored in your long-term memory. Now, listening style preferences have to do with certain variables such as people, action, contents, and time. So some people are more people oriented, and therefore, if you ask them to listen to a conversation about another person, it will be easier for them to follow than if you ask them to, listen to some content which is not very much accessible to them. Now, there are other research areas in this field, which has to do with individual differences and their possible impacts on listening and listening comprehension. One of them is empathy and basically empathetic listening. It's really an interesting area. So I would like to provide some further elaboration here and connect it to how the brain works, and make a case for empathetic listening. Well, basically, there are some neurons in our brain which are known as mirror neurons, which together they give rise to a system which is called the mirror system. So every neurotypical human being has this mirror system. For example, when you observe pain in other individuals, it triggers this mirror system, or the same network in our brain, which means that if we see pain in other people, we also start to feel uncomfortable. At some points, very uncomfortable, depending on how empathetic we are. So if you listen to someone who's talking about something interesting and happy, then we start to feel happy because if we are an empathetic listener, obviously, because the mirror system in our brain starts to react and get activated, and the other person, we replicate the feelings and the mental status of the other person in our brain as well. This act of replication of other people's cognitive states or mental states is called vicarious state. For example, if we see pain in the listener, in the speaker, we actually replicate that feeling, and some humans actually go on to take some prosocial steps to alleviate the pain of others. That's in other words, sociability has implications for listening and vice versa. We listen and we empathize with other people, and of course, at a higher level, we can also take some prosocial steps to other people who are in pain. In the same way, if someone is talking about something disgusting and is telling you how disgusted he or she is about an object or even another person, uh, if you are an empathetic listener, you might start to feel that feeling of disgust or feeling of discomfort in you, or perhaps even something even deeper. That means that you are going through this vicarious state. Then we have communication and receiver apprehension. Well, basically, these are some feelings of anxiety that are brought about because of an act of communication. Some people are, for example, anxious. They feel anxious as a result of the stage fright when they have to stand, for example, on a stage and deliver something. In the same way, some people feel anxious if they have to listen and communicate with another person. This is called communication apprehension. And it's actually regulated in a subcortical area in the brain, which is called the amygdala. Receiver apprehension is also more or less about a similar concept, meaning that if you feel that you, for example, you have to listen to a lecture, which is a very important lecture, but at the same time you know that you don't have a very good grasp of that idea or that concept which the professor is going to discuss, then you might feel anxious before and even during listening to the lecture, because you might feel that you may miss on some of the points. Now these two last factors, that's communication and receiver apprehension, are extremely related to listening under exam conditions, where the test taker knows that if they miss on some piece of information that's being played, um, they will not have another chance to listen to it again and understand, and therefore they may miss one or two items. So I would say that the anxiety under, for example, high stakes test conditions would be a lot higher than, for example, a normal or daily kind of conversation. Now, together, the three approaches to listening which I have presented uh, have been synthesized into an organizing framework, which was published in 2006 by Imhoff and Janicek, and also was replicated in Bodhi's paper, which I'm presenting. This is the organizing framework as you see it. It consists of three stages. The first stage is presage, the second stage is process, and the last one is products. As you can see, the presage stage consists of person factors and listening context. And the process includes mental processes and overt behavior, which means that the process stage actually synergizes the two previous approaches, which I talked about. That's information processing approach and listening as competency approach. And finally, products consists of knowledge acquisition, relationship building, and affective. I explained these a little bit in this slide. Some of these concepts have already been discussed. Some of them are not that discussed. So the presage or the antecedent stage has to do with the personal and contextual conditions. Well, meaning that if you have a certain personality, as I just mentioned, or if you are within a certain context, for example, in an academic context, that condition per se can already be a determinant or a determining factor of the success of your listening process or listening comprehension. So, where we are listening and how we are listening and whom we are listening to are all determining factors that can affect your listening comprehension success. Now, regarding process, I would like to just point to top-down processing and bottom-up processing. These two have been discussed in details in other videos that I've created. Uh, so I just provide a kind of brief introduction to these here. Top-down processing is when we rely on our prior knowledge, on heuristics, on some stereotypes and experiences and scripts or schema that we have stored in our brain to impose structure and order on the new situation or on the message that we listen to. On the other hand, a bottom-up process is more faithful to the message that we hear. So we kind of expend a greater deal of time, more effort, and mental energy in systematically building decisions, uh, building or building beliefs or a sense of knowing. So, which means that bottom-up processing, from this perspective, is basically mindful, as they say, whereas the top-down processing is mindless in the sense that uh, I think this would be a very good analogy in the sense that your brain is like on an autopilot state where you listen, but you don't make a great deal of effort. You don't spend too much time to understand the message deeply and to remain faithful to it. So you just keep checking it against whatever world knowledge and viewpoints and even dogmas and stereotypes that you have. That's why we call it mindless. I think too much top-down processing versus bottom-up processing can be a distinctive feature that would differentiate between an open-minded person and a less open-minded person, in the sense that a less open-minded person tries not to impose too much stereotypes or too much of his schema and heuristics onto what he or she hears, whereas he remains open and tries to spend some time and make some effort and spend some mental energy to systematically understand what the other person is talking about. Uh, as you know, for academics and for scientists, actually for anybody, uh, this is a very important attribute. So, in the same way, we can differentiate between controlled versus automatic listening, meaning that this kind of bottom-up processing would be regarded as more controlled, whereas this kind of top-down processing, which I explained, would be considered as more automatic. Now, there are four key processes here in the model that we're talking about. The first process or the first stage is called attention. Like I said before in the previous installment of this video, attention refers to the process of fixing the mind on something. Uh, those of you who are more, technologically inclined can add to it that it also refers to the process of fixating eyes on something. If you are paying attention to something, it doesn't mean that you understand it. We start to understand or comprehend it in the second stage. That's where decoding and interpretation starts. Decoding is the process of recognition and actually perception and recognition, which is then followed by the top-down and bottom-up processing. I'll explain this later in the third installment of this video. And then we do all of these processes using our memory systems, working memory system and long-term memory system. Now, the idea of working memory is fundamental to listening and also reading. So I'd like to spend some time a little bit just to explain how we can define a working memory and working memory capacity. According to Badley's model of working memory, we can consider three components for working memory, which would be also active during listening, particularly the phonological loop. That's the first component, which consists of articulatory loop and the acoustic store. Another component of working memory is episodic buffer, which actually acts as something to bind different components of working memory. The last one is visual spatial sketchpad. So the information that's visual and spatial will be processed in this sketchpad. On the other hand, the information that's phonological will be processed in the phonological loop. And if there are two types of information, as I said, the episodic buffer would bind these two pieces of information and will help processing it. And finally, the products of listening could be outcomes such as knowledge acquisition or building a relationship or reinforcing that relationship with someone or affect and feelings and emotions. So let's now move on to another section of this presentation, which is the integrated cognitive theory of comprehension, in which I'll discuss how comprehension is defined and how it can be operationalized and perhaps assessed.